First of all, my name is Toby Hagler. I'm a software architect at Phase 2 Technology. I've been there for about 5 years. I've been doing Drupal development in one way or another for about 10 years. So I've worked through a number of major core releases, yes, from 4.7. Actually, started doing Drupal with 4.5, and have seen a lot of core changes. I've seen core break a lot of things. Hasn't always been fun. So anyway, hopefully I'll be able to take you through the process of upgrading your module from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. So to begin, here's just a quick overview of the things that I'm going to cover in this session. Some things, what to do, what concepts you'll need to know before you really begin. You'll determine what it is that you're actually upgrading. Because the Drupal 7 module that you have now may not be the same the Drupal 8 module that you want to have when you're done. And so finally, some of the methods and tricks that you can use to upgrade your module. So what this session is and is not, this session is going to be pretty technical in nature. I tend to talk a little fast for a Southerner, so bear with me. But I'm not going to focus a whole lot on code. I will have some code examples and some snippets and try to explain some of that. But rather than point out some of the big code-related changes that have changed in Drupal 7 or since Drupal 7, I'll give you an introduction to the things that you might need to know about, and then where to go find more information. So this is really kind of an introduction to upgrading D7 modules to D8. So yeah, it's impossible to cover everything that I want to cover in 40-minute sessions. So I'll just give you the basics. So it's important to know what the session will not cover. Some of this is related to Drupal module development. Some of it is to Drupal building in whole. Drupal uses Twig now for theming. It abandons the PHP template engine. A lot of the theme functions do remain the same, more or less, with some changes, but your templates aren't going to be PHP templates anymore. That's important if your module does any kind of theming or theme overrides. So it's good to know that I'm not going to really cover that. Drupal 8 also allows for a lot of really good automated testing. I just don't have time to talk about that either. Also, things aren't quite stable enough in the testing arena with Drupal 8 yet. Beta was just released this past week, so still a lot to do. A lot of critical issues that have to be resolved. There was something like 120 critical issues alone before release candidates in order. So. So I won't go into automated testing, although that's a huge, big plus in Drupal 8. Definitely worth some time if you're doing big projects. If your module requires other contrib modules as a dependency, there's not a lot you can do there. The best suggestion is, of course, work with the maintainer of that module, submit patches. Patches are always welcome. And offer to help with testing. Test everything that comes out. If you have a module that your module depends on, try to work with the maintainer of that module and see what you can help. I mean, it's all a big team effort. We're all on the same team, really, in the community. So I can't possibly talk about all the things that have changed in Drupal 8, but these are just some of the big ones that come to mind. So it's important to kind of give you a sense of what has changed. It's every time you have a Drupal core update, there's API changes. We all know this. We've seen this before. It's important to know. So Drupal.org has a list of changes between versions. Those are important. You can kind of check that out on your own. Object-oriented programming has a huge focus in Drupal 8. It's a concept that a lot of Drupal developers, in fact, a lot of Drupal developers are Drupal developers as opposed to, other frameworks like Symfony, because they don't know object-oriented programming. It has a higher level, higher bar to entry to do development. So a lot of folks like Drupal because they don't have to know a lot of some of the higher-end concepts in programming, and they can still have the comfort of working in a CMS in a development framework like Drupal. Well, that's kind of going away a little bit. So Symfony 2, it's a great HTTP-centric API framework, and it's going to allow us to have things like, we get rid of hook menu completely. That's gone. We get things like headless Drupal. You can use Drupal to build static HTML pages, so people are interacting with static HTML generated by Drupal, rather than hitting a dynamically generated page every time. Massive performance gains with that. You can also use Drupal as an API, so you can store data in an API in Drupal, and then other services can hit that. You can have mobile services that hit it, and so on. So it's HTTP. It's not just web pages. Another big change was with Entity API. So Entity API was something that was introduced into Drupal 7 very late in the game, and as such, it didn't get a lot of love. It didn't get a lot of proper testing. It was just kind of tossed in at the last minute. It almost didn't make it, and it was very incomplete, and you have to have things like the Entity API contrib module just to really kind of finish it. Well, in Drupal 8, that's been kind of taken care of. It's gotten a lot of TLC. It's been given a pretty thorough overhaul. So there's just a lot of those types of changes that are important to know about core Drupal before you begin. So, all right, before you begin, just another quick set of changes. The file structure of your Drupal install has changed quite a bit. You don't put stuff in sites/all/modules/contrib in the module name, and now it just goes into /modules. The same is true for /themes. The notion is that nobody likes those long paths. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. That's important to know that your modules are in a different place now. The site's default directory still exists. That's where you still have settings.php. It's also where you have settings.yml, which is another file that you have to have now, and the files directory for assets. Some of that still remains the same. So we talked a little bit before the session about system requirements. So here's a list of some of the main system requirements for running Drupal 8. It does require PHP 5.4 or better. That's a problem for folks that are still running Drupal 6. A lot of Drupal modules in Drupal 6, like date API comes to mind. That module just does not have a good time in later versions of PHP. I think PHP 5.3 is where some of those modules start to really break down. But anyway, Drupal 8 requires 5.4. It does require MySQL 5.0.15 specifically. It does allow for MariaDB, for Percona. Those are all very compatible with MySQL, not with ANSI SQL, and that's where some of the Postgres support, unfortunately for some, goes away. It does have to have a PDO interface, and it does have to be NODB compatible for storage engines, for primary storage engines. You can still use other storage engines, but by default, everything is going to be NODB, and you have to really work to do some other storage engines, especially if you want something like federated or archived. Right now, as of, well, when I was writing this earlier in the week, we were still on Alpha 15. We're now at Beta 1, so I'm pretty sure this still is true, that the memory, minimum memory is 128 megs. That's a lot. If you look at previous versions of Drupal, Drupal 7 required 32 megs. Drupal 5 required 16 megs. So quite a bit more memory usage. Now, this is expected to go back down to something, I hate to say reasonable, but reasonable at 64 megs. This is 64 megs per thread. So if you think about, if you have a machine that has, I'm doing math in my head in front of a live audience, and this is a bad thing, but if you have a machine that allows for 1 gig of memory for your Apache process, that means you can run up to 10 threads before your machine is just going to crash. So the lower the memory usage, the better. There's a this Drupal node here, 2289183. That's a great name, great URL. has a whole discussion about what's going on with this. It's the issue queue for it. Essentially, what it is entity and other API changes. Really just tore up caching. Right now, a cache clear just takes a ridiculous amount of time with clearing cache and rebuilding cache. So there's a full list at drupal.org/requirements. You could look at what the requirements are for every version of Drupal in the past. So useful information.
I don't know if that page does list Postgres as being.
It does list Postgres. Okay.
Okay. All right.
All right, won't be the first time I'm mistaken today, and it won't be the last. So, I know there's been a lot of discussion about.
Well, there's been problems getting it.
Yeah.
Used to install on Postgres. I'm not, of course, the SQLite is also listed. I'm not sure if they had some of that problem.
Yeah. So, all right. So, the next thing you want to do before you begin the upgrade process, you want to figure out a good development environment. I have this love-hate relationship with Vagrant. I love to hate it, I hate to love it, whatever. But it is a really good environment to develop in because you can create a VM that runs on your machine. I have probably something running right on this machine right now. Is why it takes so long to change the page, but. You can mimic what your production environment is. So if you have MAMP on your machine because that's what you're used to doing, and you have PHP 5.2 because your old site breaks in PHP 5.3, and since 5.4 is a requirement, you can get something like a CentOS or Ubuntu VM with whatever kernel you like. With PHP 5.4, and if you really want to try out Nginx instead of Apache, you can do that without having to mess with your local machine. It's an isolated environment to work in. So if you still feel like you want to use MAMP or WAMP or whatever, you can. You just want to make sure that your PHP versions aren't going to clash with older versions of your module. You can use something like Homebrew as a package manager. Homebrew is a great package manager on the Mac. You can switch between versions. It just puts it in what it calls the cellar. When you're not using that version, it's still installed. It's just you can tell it which binary you want it PHP, quote quote, to point at. So those are some good development environments that you want to keep in mind. You're also going to need Drush 7. Drush 7 is the one that's going to be compatible with Drupal 8. Other versions just aren't going to work. It's kind of a pain because, well, first of all, you have to install Drush with Composer, which is sort of the new de facto PHP dependency manager. It's kind of sort of a replacement for what Peckle used to be. So you have to have Composer installed. If you didn't have it before, you have to have it now. Plus, Composer is a big important tool whenever you're dealing with Symfony. If you want to do standalone Symfony projects. So you can't rely on the package manager that you've been using to install Drush. If you used apt-get or yum or whatever to install Drush, you'll actually want to use that to uninstall Drush and then go to GitHub and follow the instructions there for installing Drush. Drush isn't even hosted on Drupal.org anymore. They're one of several projects that are going to GitHub for management. Also, there's some slight changes with the new version of Drush. You don't have CCL. You have Drush CR, which is roughly the same thing. Yeah, it's things like that. Some slight changes that your muscle memory is going to be a bigger problem than using the new version of Drush than anything. So, all right. Now this is important. I want to take a second just to pause to let this concept sink in. Before you upgrade your module to Drupal 8, you want to make sure that your Drupal 7 version is meeting all of the best code standards and practices. That's a really big step in upgrading a module from 7 to 8. First of all, you don't want to upgrade a subpar module, right? You don't want to let a bunch of bugs that you have in your old version carry on to the new version. Also, you want to make sure that stylistically your code is up to Drupal 7's standards before you go to Drupal 8, because one of the first things we're going to try to do here is use automated tools to upgrade your module. All of those things rely on the fact that your module is well written and follows code standards, that it can read, parse, and comprehend that code in order to get it to the appropriate Drupal 8 equivalent. Also, while you're doing this, documentation is going to be completely invaluable. I can't stress enough how valuable documentation of your old module is. Damian Conway once said, documentation is a love letter that you write to your future self, and that's absolutely true. You may have heard a similar corollary to this. Always code as if the person who ends up maintaining your code is a violent psychopath who knows where you live. It comes from Code for the Maintainer. It's a great blog about best practices. But it's essential that you document your module, because when you may have written this thing 2 years ago. It's go and document it now, because when you're trying to upgrade it and you can't figure out why for the life of you this thing is not working in Drupal 8, is it because I have the wrong API code? Is it because I'm not using the right object interface anymore? What's going on? At least you know what that module is supposed to do before you try to go down the wrong path of debugging. So, and as always, XKCD is always relevant. I love this one. Yeah, I'm actually guilty of my alter ego late at night writing notes to the guy, me, taking over in the morning that has to read this code. All sorts of little notes, little narratives. But yeah, anyway. All right, so some additional things that you're going to want to learn, make sure that you understand. You need a basic understanding of object-oriented programming. It doesn't have to be crazy, but you need to at least understand the basics. You're going to want to learn how PHP namespaces work, which is a relatively new concept. And you don't have to know Symfony 2, but you have to know that Symfony 2 is what's behind the routing system in Drupal as a replacement for hook menu.
Similar to Rails routing system, isn't it?
It's very similar, yeah. Yeah, in fact, you're going to look at it for the first time and feel like you've seen it, for a million years. Yeah, it's nothing new. So, some additional things that you're going to want to have at least a passing familiarity. I'm not going to be able to teach you these things, but I can at least introduce you to the concept. So, just a quick show of hands. Who's got some object-oriented programming experience? Okay, so about half. I'm terrible with math. That's why I program. So I'll kind of run through just some basic concepts. So first of all, inheritance in object-oriented programming. The concept is basically you can have a class. I'm sure you've seen classes before. It's just another data type like integer, string, whatever. It's just more complex and one that you can define yourself. But you basically can extend a class. The subclass then inherits all the methods. A method is just a class's function. It's just another name for function from the parent class. It lets you override those methods or retain their original functionality. And I'll show a better example of inheritance here in a second. Namespaces is a little bit familiar with namespaces. Okay, but yeah. It's more of this. Yeah, namespaces is kind of tricky. You think of it like this: the namespace is basically a way to use containers to put your code. You put your code in separate containers, and it no longer matters if you use the same function name or the variable name or whatever. Think of it like the file directory structure on your computer. You can have /home/user1 and /home/user2, and you can have two files with the same exact name with different content in both. It doesn't matter that the names of the files are the same because they're namespaced differently. That's all directory structure really is. And in fact, when you write the namespace syntax in PHP, it looks like directory structure. It doesn't necessarily correspond to the file structure, but it's kind of there. The concept is the same. So here is an example of inheritance in action. What you've got in the first panel, we're defining a person class, and this person has a name property. There's also a method called getName, which just returns that property. We instantiate that person by saying someone equals new person. I don't think I really need quotes, but it was late. Drunk Toby was doing this slide, I think. And then you can say name equals someone arrow name, which returns the property of this class instance. There's a difference between class and the instance of that class. The instance is basically the actual thing that you're working on. Class is the template that defines, So, a class is a definition, just like whenever we define schema in our modules install file. An instance is when you create a new object of that class that contains your data. It executes all the methods. It's kind of like the individual records that go in the database based on that schema that you defined originally in your module. So here's an example. Actually, let me go back because I didn't explain the other slide here. But what you've got going on is you have another class called employee, which extends the person class and just does some kind of extra stuff. Here we have what's called a constructor function. I'm not going to bother explaining that, but essentially what that lets you do is add some additional functionality to that class that didn't exist in the person class. And so an employee is going to be a person, but a person is not necessarily an employee. Just that simple, dog animal logic. So to talk about namespaces just a little bit, you declare it. You have this file here. You declare it. The very first line, it's kind of like a doc type, has to be namespace and then the actual namespace that you want to use. So you can do things like define a constant. Lots of modules can define status constant if they're properly namespaced. It doesn't matter. We define our class person. We have just random functions thrown in there. It doesn't matter. And then elsewhere in your project, you can reference that create person function directly, magically, by just prefixing it with a namespace. You don't. It's important to know, by the way, that you're not using include or require or any of those types of functions. PHP just kind of magically knows where to get this, and that's a long story as to why that is, but it's just magic. Trust me.
Obviously, you're going to have an issue of clashing namespaces.
You can clash namespaces, but that's a lot easier to fix because Drupal has some namespace naming standards. So for instance, everything that you see in Drupal will begin with /Drupal/ the name of the module / whatever piece of functionality you're dealing with. It's very similar to if you're defining Drupal behaviors in JavaScript. That's basically namespacing. It's not, but the concept is the same. So you kind of define, you can define my module / something. So as long as it begins with the name of your module, really, your namespace is going to be fairly safe from someone else nabbing that same space namespace. It's kind of like when you create a helper function. You always start your function with underscore, the name of your module, underscore, and then something descriptive about your function, just to make sure that no one has that. Well, you don't have to do any of that anymore. You just do it one time rather than to all your functions. So you just do it one time with your namespace. So your namespace is generally my module / something. So yeah, I mean, you would have potentially clashing namespaces if someone else grabbed the same thing. So don't start off your namespace with ctools. That's just don't use my module because that's my namespace, my module. Yeah. So So anyway. The final thing you want to do before you begin, I know we're halfway through the session, right? We haven't even begun to update our module. Determine the success criteria. You want to find out what the MVP of your Drupal 8 version is going to be. The reason for this is there's a lot of things that were in contrib modules that are now in core, right? So there's a lot of things that you may not have to do in your module that you had to do in your Drupal 7 version. So it's important to know those kinds of things and figure out exactly what it is that you actually have to do. So, I mean, you're essentially rewriting your module. You're going to try to copy and paste a lot of code from it, but you're essentially writing a new module. I mean, that's ultimately what we're talking about doing. So you want to make sure that you're only putting stuff in that new module that you have to. Also, you know, sometimes you have a module that's existed for a number of years and you have a lot of cruft in there, and now it's kind of a good time to start cleaning house and getting some of that old cruft out, getting some of the old features out that just aren't applicable anymore. So it's just good to know what it is that you actually have to build in order to call your upgrade a successful upgrade. So the first thing we're going to do when you're trying to take your module from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, is try automation. Let's just kind of roll the dice and see if we can not have to do any work. Because as a programmer, I don't like to work. I just like to run scripts that do all my work for me. So Drupal Module Upgrader. It's a D8 module. It's still in development. It's still in active development. There's a new dev release almost every day. But it might be able to do a lot of the work for you. At the very least, this module allows for generating a report of all the things that have to change. It'll identify a lot of the known API functions. It'll identify hooks, and it'll tell you what they get changed to. So even though it's not able to do all the work for you yet, and it's getting there, I have faith, it'll at least tell you what you have to do. Also, it'll go ahead and it does a lot of the valuable reporting and a lot of the spelunking on your code, and it will actually lay the foundation for the new file structure that your module has to follow. Because one thing I haven't shown here is what the module file structure looks like in Drupal 8. It's a bit different, but this will go ahead and take care of a lot of that for you. Pardon me. So the basic steps of using automated tools, you're going to just put your Drupal 7 module in the modules directory of your D8 site. The next step is you're going to run Drush DMU analyze in the name of the module. What it'll do is generate an HTML file that as a report of everything that has to change. And then finally, if you've addressed everything in that report, you don't see anything really, really bad, then you can try, you can roll the dice and run Drush DMU upgrade, and then make some changes and run it again, make some changes, and hopefully maybe you can get something that halfway works in Drupal 8 without doing a whole lot of work yourself. So this is, what I did was the weight module in Drupal 7. One of the projects that I'm working on now, actually trying to take a Drupal 6 site to Drupal 8, uses the weight module, and they have a good version that works in Drupal 7. I wanted to see if we can get it to work in Drupal 8, so I wanted to see what was involved. Well, this was, it's a very small module. It just kind of does one thing. It basically lets you select the sort order for nodes of a particular content type and views. And it's only a couple of hundred lines of code. And it generated an analysis report that was longer than the module file itself. So there's a lot of things that get changed. So you know, by and large, this is kind of what you can expect to see when you run Drush DMU analyze. You get this upgrade file, upgrade info.html file that it's just stuck in your module directory. So you can view it in a browser and, you know, print it out, do whatever you like to do. But it'll give you a list of everything that kind of needs to change, what class you want to use or what interface you need to use, because that hook is deprecated. So, for instance, you'll notice in this report it's complaining a lot about hook form alter. Conceptually, that hook is deprecated. A lot of the form manipulation stuff is changed because there's actually a form interface that you're using rather than just straight up form hooks. So it's not handled very well here, and so that's why you see a bunch of error messages about hook form alter. So this is just a directory listing after running that DMU upgrade. on the wait module. You'll notice that the automated process, it did leave some stuff behind. All of those .info files, you don't need those anymore. You can get rid of them. So that's really all there is with automated upgrading at the moment. It might work, so it's always worth a shot. At the very least, it's going to help you at least set a roadmap of what has to be changed in your module. You'll notice that you no longer have wait.info, but you'll have wait.yml that defines roughly the same thing. All right, so finally, we've talked about all that. You've tried upgrading. This automated process just isn't there yet, so we've got to do it the hard way. So the very basics of upgrading to a Drupal 8 module, I'm just going to take two very good examples of the process that you would follow with menus and forms. Those are two things that you see all the time in custom modules. So first of all, hook menu's dead. Long live the new routing system. Everything in your routing is now defined with YAML files, not in a hook menu in your .module file. So the very first thing you're going to want to do when you try to make this thing work is let's just make it D8 compatible. It's not going to work, but let's make it so that Drupal 8 at least recognizes that you have a module there. So the first step of that is remove module.info. Replace it with module.info.yaml. Now I said before, that's a terrible color choice. You can't hardly see that, but what you've got here is a YAML key value pair listing of everything that you had in your .info file to begin with. Virtually everything is the same. The only thing that we changed is core goes from 7.x to 8.x. And to be fair, this was done actually with the Drupal module upgrader. It generated all these YAML files for me. I didn't have to do all that. But all of these YAML file formats are very well documented on Drupal.org, and I'll show you where those are at in a minute.
Is the core delimiter going to stay 8.x or is it going to be 8.0.x?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to. Everything that I've seen so far is saying 8x, because 8.1.0 should still, everything that was written for 8 should still work for 8.1 and 8.2.0 and so on. The idea is that forward compatibility is important now, thankfully, after 15 years, I don't know, whatever. No, it's, yeah, exactly. So yeah, the idea is that my understanding is that it will remain. I don't know for sure. I may be lying to you. Yeah, the idea is that 8.x should be sufficient enough, and you may have to define that later. It may actually get to the point where you can define this module does require 8.1.x because you're taking advantage of some new functionality that's an 8.1 that's not an 8.0. So that might be something to look for. So the next thing you want to do to make your module compatible with Drupal 8 is you have to create a config directory. You're going to put a lot of stuff in there. There's the new config API. That's something that I haven't told you is brand new in Drupal 8, but it is. Again, you're going to put some important settings in module.settings.yaml in the config directory. This is all just following config API, if you want to look it up on Drupal. Variable set, variable get, variable delete, they're all gone. You're going to define everything here. And to make changes to variables and things like that, you're going to use the Drupal scope config function. Drupal is the names, Drupal is the name of the object, and without having to instantiate it, you could just say Drupal : config and call basically the I forget what it's called, the interface version of that function, rather than having to instantiate a Drupal class every time. But anyway, I'll show you an example of that. So you want to make your module compatible further by putting your schema in config/schema/module.schema.yaml. You can define multiple tables by having multiple files in here. It's not very much unlike what you used to define in hook schema, except instead of being a PHP array, you're following YAML. YAML is supposed to be very easy to read. It's not that great to write, but it's very easy to look at and see what's going on. So just for an example, this is what it looks like in Drupal 7 when you have a particular item defined by hook menu. That PHP array that you define for a particular thing. This is from the book module. I just took something that I knew was already working. So this comes in core. But you've defined, for instance, the admin/content/book admin menu callback. And here is the routing.yml version of that. The important thing to know is that all of the array elements are still roughly there. Instead of the path being an element of the items array, it now gets its own key value pair. You can set defaults. You can set things like underscore content is the name of the callback function that you want to use. And in this particular case, we're using a namespace of Drupal, which is the Drupal, it's Drupal core. Drupal/book, the name of the module, controller, because they have a list of controllers for that particular module, and book controller, which is the name of the class, and they're using the scope operator here to say admin overview. And so what this does is you could potentially name the admin page in every single module in the world to admin overview, and as long as it's got a different namespace, they're not going to collide. So that's just an example of why namespacing is pretty nifty. So you want to convert all your page callbacks to controllers. So this is what that router, that routing YAML file points to this other file here, and I'm going to kind of breeze through this because I'm running out of time. But essentially what that does is lets you name your admin overview function as part of your book controller class. It's in this namespaced file that nothing else can clobber just because they name it the same thing. Now I said that the hook menu is gone. There are some other hook menu changes that actually still exist. Hook menu alter is gone, but there are very specific hooks that have been added to replace. So you can do things like tasks and contextual links and all the different types of menus that you always had to look up the constants for because I could never remember as many times as I've typed it out. I had to look it up every single time at api.drupal.org. But yeah, so essentially, there's a separate hook for each one of those now. So it's just important that I mention that. Moving on to form functions. This is what it looked like when you defined a form in Drupal 7. You had a form function, then automatically, just by naming conventions, you had a validate and a submit handler for that particular function. You didn't really have to do anything for it. Of course, your Forms API code is just a big array that defines the form. In Drupal 8, it's very similar. Your array definitions remain the same. However, your form function is replaced by the form interface. And so the form interface defines 4 different methods. The form ID, the build form, which is where that array actually goes, and then validate form and submit form methods that do all the same things that those magically named functions did in the past. Oh, did you want to go back? Okay, yeah, I'll just type all that down. So the object interface is just another thing in object-oriented program that allows you to create code that specifies which methods a class must implement without actually having to define how they're handled. So a form interface, you can kind of sort of think of it as like an outline of a class. It's basically like a non-functioning class that just defines all the methods that do nothing, but it just makes sure that they're all there. So, so here's how that exact same form looks in Drupal 8. We start off defining our class form example object, which implements. Earlier we extended a class, but you're not extending a class. You're implementing an interface, which is You can kind of think of it as the same thing to a different type of object. You'll note that all 4 methods that we just talked about are here. Get form ID, build form, validate form, submit form, they're all here. But the nice thing is you don't have to make sure that you type those function names exactly right, because sometimes, when you have a long module name, and you have, module name / underscore blah, 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 underscore validate, you're going to get a typo and spend, half an hour trying to figure out why your validator is not firing. This eliminates a lot of that. You don't have to define validate form and validate and submit form because you've implemented this interface. Those methods do exist unless you override them here. So that's another benefit. So in the context of creating an admin interface for your module, we always used to have to use, define a form function. So in hook menu, you defined the callback as Drupal get form, and you pass the parameter as the name of your form function. And then that form function would use system settings form to do all the proper manipulation of the form so that it was, handled as an administrative form and set all the system variables for you. This does all that for you. So first of all, you don't have to define all that anymore in hook menu. You're doing that in your router.yml file. Here we're using a namespaced settings form, and this just handles everything. You'll notice, by the way, where's that at? What's that? Yeah, so that use, by the way, is in there because you've declared the namespace for this file, but you want to use another namespaced file to go ahead and get some of the predefinitions, some of the things that are predefined for you, added to this so that you're not having to do it. So that's similar to how you would say system settings form wrapped around the form that you generated, because it would add extra validators and extra submit handlers for doing system administrative level processing of your form that you wanted for saving things as system variables, for instance. All right. Just about out of time. So I want to show you some really good bits about debugging your upgrade. So Drupal 8's new. It's wildly different, and you're going to be not sure, did I implement a class wrong? Did I instantiate something incorrectly? Is my, just not knowing where the problem is. So first of all, read the messages. You're going to start seeing a lot of new styles of error messages that you didn't see before because you're using namespace files and you're using object-oriented programming. You're going to get different types of error messages that you didn't get before. 9 times out of 10, that'll tell you exactly where you've gone wrong. It'll tell you which namespaced file it's complaining about. And in the past, when you define something incorrectly in Drupal and you pass the wrong, a wrongly formed object to a function, and it would complain about, entity API has thrown an error or has thrown an exception, and you Bootstrap. Yeah, or Bootstrap, has thrown an exception, and that has nothing to do with what you did, but because you've had some sort of malformed object that you passed to another function, and then it just trickled. This kind of eliminates that sort of like having to guess where things went wrong. So when you're dealing with namespaced files, it'll actually complain about that particular file, your file that is part of your module, and it'll tell you kind of where things went wrong. Also, the debug function in Drupal 8 is so wonderful. It's basically devel with DPM and all that stuff thrown in. And then finally, especially if you've got a white screen of death, tail-f on the error log. I mean, yeah. So, those are all very valuable things to know. Just kind of where to get started. Now, when you're debugging, all right, first of all, when you're doing Drupal upgrade development work, you're updating your database frequently, right? Yes? Yeah, I want to see heads. Back up your database frequently. The reason I say that is because Drupal 8, even in beta, is still very unstable and things break, and it's sometimes very hard to recover from, and it's just easier. It'll save you time trying to debug something that you don't care about, because that API is going to change in a few weeks anyway. So just keep a backup going and so on. So remove hook install and hook uninstall. Sometimes those are still throwing some bugs. There's a lot of bugs surrounding those particular hooks in Drupal 8 still. So just removing those sometimes will get your module working again, because Drupal was trying to rebuild cache and it came across those and it gets into kind of a weird, nasty loop. Drupal is compiling some PHP files in the site's default files PHP directory. So if you're having some trouble seeing your changes show up, delete that directory. Of course, rebuild cache using Drush CR. And finally, if none of that's working, just uninstall and reinstall your module. Sometimes the way Drupal 8 is caching your module still in alphas and the most recent beta, it still has some issues there. So almost out of time. Only 1 minute over. So here's some helpful resources that'll kind of get let you get your hands dirty, because I've really only kind of scratched the surface. You want to get into the nitty-gritty details. So here's just 5 URLs if you want to write them down, and I'm going to post my slides on the Phase 2 website later. I'm going to have somebody do it because I don't know how to use that website. I'm just kidding. So there are some Drupal posts about converting a Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 module. It goes over a list of API changes, and as those changes change, that page hopefully gets updated. So it'll show you how to convert your .info file into module.yml. It'll show you how to convert a lot of those things for you. There's a lot of resources and tutorials at this particular node, 211.6001. It just has a list of links to lots of tutorials and blog posts that you might find pretty valuable. Creating Drupal 8 modules, this is really just about creating modules from scratch, but sometimes it's useful to know how to build a new module in Drupal 8, because you can figure out the functionality and you want to learn how to build a Drupal 8 properly.
And is there a Drupal 8 sample directory? Of newly written modules, for example?
There's the examples project.
Yes, there's the examples project. Is the most beautiful collection of code for learning how to develop in Drupal that you could hope for. Examples is it's just examples is the module, and there's 20 or 30 modules that do different things. So you'll find a module on creating content types. You'll find a module on creating a custom form element. If you want to learn by example, the example module is a great way to go in and see how someone else has done it.
In Drupal 8.
Many of them are in Drupal 8. They're not all converted yet, but that's very much in line. In fact, I think I used some examples from the examples module. So. And finally, this php.net URL, the OOP reference guide, it's sort of the quintessential place to learn about PHP object-oriented programming. So, all right, any questions? Yeah.
I got a quick one. You said our modules now live in module folder down at the root. Mm-hmm. Where did core go? There's a core directory. There's also a source directory. The file structure in general has shifted around a lot. So core's moved out of the way.
Yeah, there's a core directory.
Well, and it kind of goes in line with namespaces. I mean, it doesn't matter, if you put stuff in root now or not, because you put it in another directory. Yeah.
If you do a upgrade, I presume that's not going to wipe out everything in root anymore like you used to.
Probably.
Core's moved off to its own directory.
Yeah. Core. Yeah, a lot of the core modules have, they're all in the core directory. There's also the source directory. There's a couple of others. I can't remember off the top of my head. No. That's a good question. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Just curious, if you actually use the console modules yet. it actually it generates some modules for you. I saw some stuff.
I have for Drupal 8. I have not. For Drupal 7, of course, I still use Nano instead of Vi when I'm in a Linux environment. So don't, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. But I use the module builder module a lot to generate the skeleton of a module. So I have not messed with it for Drupal 8 yet, but last I looked, that wasn't available for Drupal 8, but I anticipate seeing something very soon. In fact, Drupal 8, the core team has been kind of telling people, hold off making your upgrades until we get a beta. Well, we have a beta now, so you're going to start seeing some of these modules getting some Drupal 8 love. So yeah, so you're probably, especially the ones that help developers build modules, are going to come
because
along.
somebody really wants that.
Yes, yeah. There's going to be a lot of support for that. Also, there's my contact information. If you think of questions, if you have another question that you think of, like, I want to think of a million questions as soon as I get in my car and drive off. So, feel free to ping me, however you want. So, all right. Well, thank you for your time.